Welcome back to another edition of the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is a weekend weed review. We cover everything that is cannabis. So we're going to jump right into a new national cannabis survey. Apparently, the StatsCan chief statistician chose cannabis as a 2018 top data issue. They looked at all the data, came up with top 10 lists for 2018, and decided that cannabis was a choice over all other contenders, calling 2018 an action-packed year in the world of data. The list is based on the many newsworthy topics explored over the course of the year. The agency created the Cannabis Stats Hub to provide a one-stop shop for new information on cannabis and to measure the impacts of legalization. The new National Cannabis Survey found that Quebec had the lowest rate of cannabis use among provinces, and the last cannabis economic accounts shows Canadians spent $5.9 billion, expressed in annual rates in nominal terms, on cannabis products in the third quarter of 2018. Almost 84% of that was purchased illegally for non-medical use. So jumping into a Forbes article with Surgeon Generals believing that it's high time to think about the science-driven policy for cannabis research. Countries like China and Israel, where several funds are appropriated for cannabis research, are seeking vigorous innovations that could shift the entire global market for pain relief within the world's aging population alone. At the close of 2018, the U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams called on the federal government to rethink marijuana's classification as it pertains to medical research. While the Surgeon General did not go so far as to condone legalization for recreational use, he did say that medically marijuana should be studied, noting that while I support local solutions to help solve our national public health challenges, they must be led by science-driven policy. Currently, the National Institute of Health funded research on marijuana is pressing forward, and we are making progress in studying marijuana and its impact on the human brain, body, and behavior, as well as on our communities. We should continue to seek ways to encourage and enable research to better inform policies regarding the potential medicinal properties of marijuana. I could point to several studies, including Dr. Ethan Russo. Just at the bare basics, our endocannabinoid system has CB1 and CB2 receptor cells. So if our body is naturally programmed to receive cannabidiol, and CBD, and THC, I think that's a pretty good start. I'll post a link to that below. So all of that is great, and yet I think stigma is still an issue. So Canada recently went legal, and some of this hyperbole is that the stigma is gone, and Vancouver first opens their cannabis stores to rec shops as all of these stores come on board. I just think we're not even close to that, as a lot of people still view cannabis as a drug and drug dealers. I don't think we're nearly close to the normalization and the respect that cannabis should get over pharmaceutical, for example. Deja vu seems to occur as every new region, state, country goes on board. Prices skyrocket and supply diminishes because there aren't the legal pathways to provide the necessary at the beginning or onset of any legalization. So of course, Canadian companies are dealing with inconsistent supply because they weren't given enough of the product to begin with right off the bat. It takes time, obviously, to grow it, manufacture the product, and deal with all of the legislation or regulation around packaging. So in the midst of a cannabis shortage, some Edmonton pot shops have simply closed their doors until they can have stock to sell. Some businesses have decided, while unpredictable, it's good enough to wait for the shortage to ride out, hoping that their patience with the budding industry will pay off. When one person was quoted as saying, "We need to see some stability and consistency in terms of stock and what's coming in." So here's a complete guide to cannabis retailers in Canada. You can find this at seekingalpha.com. In summary, the Canadian cannabis retail market is unique in that provincial government will act as the wholesaler in almost all provinces. Despite the initial positive developments, recent slowdown in licensing and severe supply shortages have resulted in near-term headwinds. We remain cautious about the cannabis retailers as a group in Canada and believe that the government-controlled distribution model will hamper their ability to manage supply chains and optimize profits. We prefer to wait to see what happens in 2019 before for recommending an investment in Canadian cannabis retail stocks. We think there are three major challenges facing the retailers in Canadian provinces that don't allow privately run retail stores. As we discussed the provinces initially in the Complete Cannabis Guide number 4, Provincial Regulations in Canada, the provinces have adopted different models when it comes to cannabis retail. All of the provinces except Saskatchewan will control distribution, which means that the wholesale margin will be controlled by the government. The US has got the same issues though. If we have different states with different rules and you can't even cross borders, they don't have that issue. They just have to deal with different packaging requirements for different provinces, which I think is easier than trying to deal in an illegal market, but it's still ridiculous given the fact that it's legal. Early in the year, we had Murphy's Law when a fire hit a licensed Alberta cannabis grow operation on the eve of the first shipment. I don't think you can get much worse timing than that, which is really too bad. It's hard enough already, and then to lose all of your supply that on the night before you're supposed to distribute that's painful. And I'm not even sure that they have insurance. A lot of these don't have crop loss insurance yet. Some of the hemp companies, due to the U.S. Farm Bill, they will in the U.S., Canada. I would imagine they do, but I'm not sure. So let me know in the comments. Fortunately, nobody was hurt in the fire. Everyone managed to escape safely. It's not clear what caused the fire, and a report is yet to come from local officials, but the lost plants were part of that, the loss. The first cannabis recall hits Alberta due to moldy pot. The recall, a first of its kind in Alberta, since the legalization October 17th, involves almost 1,500 units of a lot of cannabis's Eldo 7-gram jars sold to the Alberta Gaming Liquor and Cannabis. Moldy weed hits cannabis shelves, forcing the New Strike Brands and its subsidiary Up Cannabis to issue a recall on a single lot of pot. Up Cannabis. Ouch. Washington State just had a recent recall as well, with vape pens and having heavy metal pesticides. In California, Washington had a specific pesticide or herbicide called Eagle 20. Either way, whenever you heat it up, it is a carcinogen and it's not good for you. The issue in California with heavy metal content, also not a good issue. Mold, you smoke that and you're allergic to it, that's not very good. Otherwise, stick with natural, organic alternatives. Washington State University Cannabis Research shared a science confab. There's a group of researchers from Washington State University looking at the behavior of offspring of rats whose parents were dosed by different levels of cannabis. The world's largest neuroscience conference in San Diego included a variety of discussions and findings about how cannabis can impact the brain throughout life, positively and negatively. Research looked at how cannabis affected different demographic groups, including women, teens, newborns, and seniors. The research found that the offspring from mothers who were exposed to the highest amounts were more likely to have trouble adjusting their strategies in order to receive rewards. Parental exposure to cannabis may cause meaningful changes in brain development that can negatively impact cognitive functioning into adulthood. This work sets the foundation for future studies that will examine changes in the brain that might underline these alterations. This is also the most commonly used illicit substance reported among pregnant women. McLaughlin notes that the high exposure rats may not necessarily be less intelligent, just less motivated. They could be less interested in the task, not want the rewards as much, or not want to explore other avenues for treats. Maybe they just had a third eye existential experience and they see through your bullshit and they don't want to play your game anymore. What about that? But at the same time, other research indicates that it can reduce physical, short-term and long-term pain and decrease symptoms of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease. While the society members acknowledge that more people have begun accessing cannabis products for medicinal and recreational use in the last 5 years, they caution that there is very little information and even basic science understanding. The presentation concluded with a call for more research into possible negative and positive effects, especially in teens, women, pregnant women. And did you know Karachi remains the second largest consumer of cannabis in the world? I'm not sure I could point to Karachi on a map, just to be honest with you, but apparently it's a place where cannabis is still illegal and remains the second most cannabis consuming city in the world, with almost 42 tons used last year, according to the Weed Index report. New York takes the top spot with 77 tons, and New Delhi comes in third with 38 tons. Top 10 list also includes Los Angeles, Cairo, Mumbai, London, Chicago, Moscow, and Toronto, respectively. Come on, Seattle, you got to pick it up. Ridiculous. And some local news in Utah. The state and business prep for medical cannabis storage and distribution. Because we're talking about cannabis, it's highly regulated from seed to patient. So before businesses can apply capitalism to this new marketplace, there's a lot of procedures state legislators are working to install. Quote, with the passage, Utah's Medical Cannabis Act, the state of Utah must now put into place the infrastructure needed to provide cannabis medicine to Utah who can benefit. One of the most crucial aspects is the need and requirement for stringent tracking and inventory management of cannabis plants and medicine through the entire process. Developing a supply chain system for medicinal cannabis isn't terribly different from other products. The main difference is the amount of tracking and documentation needed for the state monitoring and auditing. Pretty sure you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's about half a dozen companies that already do that. All in all, I don't think Utah is paying much attention because all of these issues that they're trying to prepare for have already been solved, but I'll let you guys duke that out in the comments. Oregon, on the other hand, is preparing a bill to allow cannabis exports to other states as well as Canada. They have over 1 million pounds in silos and in storage, and they're desperately trying to get Canada on board to export this excess inventory to. Americans may soon be consuming cannabis products from Oregon if a new bill gets passed in the state. A new bill is reportedly being introduced in the state's legislature that will allow wholesalers to export the substance to other states in the U.S. where cannabis is legal. Oregon is set to introduce this bill in 2019 and allow the state to export dried cannabis to other states where the substance has already been declared legal. If passed and signed into law, the new bill will help wholesalers in the state sell cannabis to other marijuana-friendly places like Washington State and California. However, it will be illegal to transport the substance through states where it's currently illegal. The bill will attract federal attention as the provision of allowing the export of cannabis is prohibited under the current federal law. Cannabis is still under the Schedule I substance, which means at the federal level, it's not recognized as having any medicinal benefit. However, allowing for exports may be an inevitable step that Oregon will have to take. According to the Motley Fool, the state will not limit the number of licenses it issues. This will lead to a situation of oversupply, and consequently, the price of cannabis will come down. Allowing the export to other states should help reduce the supply in the state and improve the prices. While the strategy of exports seems good on paper, there are challenges. There's already an oversupply problem in Colorado, California, and Washington. The only way for Oregon to compete is to offer its cannabis at a cheaper price than the prevailing market rates in other states. Despite the supply problem, there are huge markets for cannabis-based products. According to NBC, a soda made from cannabis will soon be available for stores in Michigan. Marijuana companies are currently conducting research to bring new cannabis products in the coming months and years. So leave it to Zero Hedge for the doom and gloom. The imminent collapse. Oregon's pot glut drives prices even lower. Approximately 3 years after Oregon lawmakers signed into a recreational cannabis law, the state is now experiencing a massive glut in its marijuana supply, collapsing prices, putting dozens of the industry's licensed growers and retailers on borderline bankruptcy. For the second year in a row, cannabis farmers harvested more than 2.5 million pounds of pot in October. Of that, the so-called wet harvest, 1.3 million in usable cannabis was logged into the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission's tracking system. The state of about 4 million people harvested half a pound of cannabis per resident, which raises concern that there are too many growers. According to government data, there are 1,100 licensed active producers and another 900 producers seeking licenses from the OLCC. Everyone is concerned about this. According to Adam Smith, Craft Cannabis Alliance's executive director, you'll see people going out of business in the spring when it's planting time. There are far too many in the industry in distress. No one is making money. Last year, we saw prices plunge up to 50%. This year, prices could drop by another 30 to 50%, according to Bew Whitney, senior economist and vice president of New Frontier Data. Oregon's cannabis market is limited to sales within the state's border. With an abundance of pot, the bulletin indicates that Oregon's cannabis market is limited to sales within the state's borders. According to the Statesman Journal, in 2019, Oregon lawmakers have proposed legislation that would be the first significant step towards legalizing interstate exports of cannabis, a positive solution to the oversupply conditions. While legalizing interstate exporting of cannabis could be years away, expect in the near term a possible imminent collapse of small producers throughout Oregon. Will cannabis-infused beverages stocks live up to the hype or fizzle out? We've seen a lot of companies come in. Constellation Brands, owner of Corona, put in $4.5 billion. Coca-Cola, he put in $2 billion. Budweiser, $2 billion. Another $2 billion from Marlboro for vape. $13 billion that they put for another vape company. So big companies are coming in. Beverages, I believe, are the first to kind of come to market. And then we've already seen vape pens as well. But last year was a game changer in many ways for the cannabis industry. Canada became the first industrialized country to legalize adult use. U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved its first cannabis-derived drug. President Trump signed the Farm Bill, legalizing hemp and hemp-based cannabidiol, or CBD. And any doubts about cannabis being a valid business model was tossed out the window. Cannabis-infused beverages were all the rage in 2018. As the name suggests, a cannabis-infused beverage aims to incorporate CBD or tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, into an alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage. You can see Molson is in the game, Constellation Brands, Canopy Growth. Everybody's jumping in. Where will it go? Billions. I definitely think that turnkey products, beverages are going to be the way to go. It's going to change the industry in terms of sugary drinks, adding CBD, more of a holistic approach to get in the game with CBD, utilize its nutraceutical effects, its benefits. So as Michigan and each new state, each new country comes on board, you kind of see these new products hit the shelves. Some work, some don't. There's a product a few years back where the lid popped off because of the carbonation. So some of these smaller companies come on board. You have to figure that out. Michigan is developing regulations for a recently legalized recreational market. Products made from the cannabis plant are becoming big moneymakers. This includes CBD products like spring soda that some say has the effects of cannabis. It's supposed to make you feel a little more loose than you normally feel, says Andrew Crete, whose father owns Ideal Party Store. Crete says Michiganders are relaxing their views on products made by cannabis plants now that recreational marijuana in the state is legal. So where are we on cannabis edibles? The word is that the market for cannabis products, including edibles and drinkables, constitutes a 21st century gold rush despite their illegal regulatory status in the US. More and more investors are jumping online into the cannabis space as we see the over-the-counter markets group welcomes Harvest One Cannabis, OTCQX. Harvest One Cannabis begins trading on the OTC under the symbol HRVOF. Harvest One Cannabis is a global cannabis company that develops and provides innovative lifestyle and wellness products to consumers and patients in regulated markets around the world. The company's range of lifestyle solutions is designed to enhance quality of life. Shareholders have significant exposure to the entire cannabis value chain through 3 wholly owned subsidiaries: United Greeneries, a licensed producer, Sat Farm, and Dreamwater Global, and a minority interest in Burb Cannabis retail operations. For more information, go to harvest1.com. Cannabis stocks posted their longest run since August. This is about 2 weeks old now, but I think they're on a comeback. So a lot of companies trying to get out of this bond market. It's been a 40-year bond market bull run. I've never really seen the bond market crash long term, but as more people get out of debt and as more bonds are re-rated, I personally don't invest in cannabis stocks, but I believe that there will be a massive shift into the equity markets as people run from other sectors. The bond market is going to degrade. There's been a 40-year bull run in the bond market, and more debt is being downgraded to junk. As that happens, there's going to be pension funds and companies forced to exit, and they're not going to be able to go anywhere else. So the safe haven will become cannabis. And in market declines, sin stocks go up. So as people flee the other equities, FANGs, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, they're going to leave those and come to more speculative investments like cannabis stocks. Especially the indexes, those investment vehicles are going to go up. You're going to see market caps skyrocket relative to their revenues. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. That's a crazy bubble that's going to happen. Count on it. So pot markets marked their third consecutive week of gains, the longest which streak since August, riding on the high on a border market upbeat mood. They'll get a better idea just how the global market cannabis could get along with a host of other potential catalysts. So stay tuned. So while the industry is clearly on the rise as more and more states pass laws legalizing the use of cannabis, the industry also needs to consider the privacy and security of its systems and networks from the ground up. Because this industry is so heavily regulated and tracked, there's also a heavy amount of data collection and storage of personally identifiable information and other sensitive data. Many businesses in this industry offer consumers the ability to make purchases online or through a mobile app, use a point of sale system for their dispensaries, and maintain their data on a cloud-based software. These POS systems automatically report to states, compliance tracking systems use application programming interfaces, and all of the business's daily sales can be uploaded automatically into the state's database in one single step. In many instances, the dispensary scans a customer's ID for date of birth, state of residency, and they check them into the system to confirm what and how much the customer can buy. When you think about it, the marijuana dispensaries are hot spots for personally identifiable information, and the goal is to track every plant, product, and person associated with the production and sale of marijuana. Additionally, many of the same threats apply to the cannabis industry as those that affect all other businesses that are collecting data. Use of the public Wi-Fi by employees, loss of paper records, connected smart devices to your company's network, email and phishing scams. The cannabis businesses may want to consider implementing enterprise-wide data privacy and security compliance programs so that they have proper up-to-date security measures in place, appropriate data breach response processes, and adequate employee training. It's only important for companies in the cannabis industry to keep up with the constantly changing legislative landscape, but also with the cyber threats that pose a substantial risk to their businesses and their customers too. Hot sector focus shifts from legalization to legitimacy. After a wild year in the cannabis sector, it's appropriate that 2019 kicks off with a focus on Aphria, the Canadian pot producer that was attacked by short sellers and now the target of a hostile takeover bid. Aphria report results on the fiscal quarter. There was undoubtedly plenty of questions on the conference call about the allegations from short sellers that it overpaid for worthless assets in Latin America. Aphria called the claims by Quintessential Capital Management and Hindenburg Research, quote, malicious and self-serving, end quote. The saga took a new twist in the quiet days between Christmas and New Year's when Green Growth Brands proposed a hostile bid for Aphria, whose stock lost a quarter of its value in December. The potential offer, which is yet to be finalized, raised further questions about Aphria's link to the much smaller Green Growth, with a short seller Hindenburg Research saying it, quote, likely an attempt to generate an appearance of demand in hopes of spurring credible offers, end quote. Aphria said the offer, valued at a Canadian $2.8 billion at the time, is significantly undervalues the company. The fallout will affect the sectors as a whole, resulting in, quote, greater emphasis on corporate governance, due diligence, and M&A valuations, end quote. We can sum up the year with 3 words: legalization, legitimization, and listings. Legalization of medical marijuana has spread well beyond Canada to places like Thailand and the UK that few people saw coming. Legitimization of the drug has gathered pace at an astonishing speed, with traditional consumers and pharmaceutical companies ranging from Constellation Brands and Anheuser-Busch to Altria and Novartis investing in partnerships with pot farms. The number of cannabis listings has soared as well, with at least 149 companies worth a combined 54 billion Canadian trading on Canadian stock exchanges as of January 2nd this year. A growing number of those are U.S. firms with a market value above $1 billion. The main reason most cannabis-related concerns head north to list their shares is banking. Canada remains the land of opportunity for cannabis-related companies that want to list their stocks. A new report titled "Going Public in Canada" breaks down the pros and cons of cannabis companies going public in Canada. Canadian marijuana companies raised a landmark $12 billion last year as they prepared to meet demand in the new adult use market and grow their medical operations globally. That represents a 150% increase over 2017, when Canadian companies raised $4.7 billion, according to data compiled by Viridian Capital Advisors and shared with Marijuana Business Daily. Capital raises include everything from deals related to going public on stock exchanges to private placements, equity, debt, and strategic investments. In 2017, Canadian MJ firms were involved in 245 capital raises, averaging a Canadian 9.87 million. But those figures spiked last year to 383 deals worth 30 million Canadian. Despite the increase, capital is increasing selective and strategic. We saw a shift from funding any licensed entity to focusing on licensed entities, as well as funding larger licensed entities. We saw a shift away from funding early and pre-licensed businesses. Canada's health department recently unveiled draft regulations for edible cannabis and infused beverages, extracts, and topicals. After those products reach store shelves October of 2019, they're expected to make an important part of the overall cannabis sector. Expect to see another resurgence in capital raises, but more into the companies that are differentiating themselves. This summer, once we have a couple quarters of financials, Phillips said, cannabis funding is an entirely different story outside of North America. Overseas medical cannabis companies raised $627 million in capital, a modest increase from 2017's $519 million. There's a lot of the world that's left to get rid of cannabis prohibition. It's likely to start, as it did in Canada and the US, with a slow rollout. As governments get more comfortable, they'll put more support behind it. Small-scale cannabis growers in Canada are facing a burdening license regulations that fewer than 30 such applicants have made to Health Canada since legalization. One of the main problems regarding such licensing comes from restrictions imposed by municipalities. Few municipalities have the zoning requirements to accommodate a micro-cultivation permit. British Columbia won't rule out starting own cannabis production scheme in the future. They say it could consider establishing its own licensing scheme for cannabis production in the future. However, the province currently has no plan to take the unprecedented step. It's too speculative at this point to comment on what a plan could be, the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General said in a statement. BC reminds me a lot of the Emerald Triangle in California, where they have a lot of old school roots and they don't want change, and they'll keep it until it's perfect for them. So there's not a lot of stores open. BC Bud is infamous, and yet they're the last to open their doors. So I find that interesting. For the US to compete with places like Canada, they're going to have to allow for banking. So there's a report that a California-backed bank for cannabis businesses would face insurmountable hurdles, like losing their federal charter. So California would likely lose money and face overwhelming federal barriers if it tried to create a cannabis-backed bank to help cannabis businesses navigate banking challenges, according to a report released by the state treasurer. The report puts an end, for now, to hopes that the state would find a banking solution for cannabis businesses. Since cannabis remains a Schedule I under federal law, many banks are nervous about running afoul of the U.S. government by doing business with the industry, although some work with cannabis-related companies. That forces cannabis businesses to deal in large sums of cash at potential security risk. According to the report commissioned by a working group launched by State Treasurer John Chang, it would create a state bank that would likely waste taxpayers' money, require $1 billion in capital investment, and wouldn't become profitable for 20 to 30 years. If federal laws change during that time, or if existing private banks decide to take on risk of working with the growing cannabis industry, the need for California's state bank would disappear and become irrelevant. Public banks are rarely successful, the report found. Just 2 exist in North Dakota and America Samoa, and neither was created to deal with the cannabis industry. The report recommends that California designate a state agency to help improve how states hurdle cash-based tax and cannabis-related payments, lobby for those changes to federal law, and encourage existing private banks to work with cannabis businesses. State lawmakers rejected legislation for a state-backed bank earlier this year. The state attorney general's office also concluded a public bank for cannabis businesses is not feasible. The newest report concluded that the only effective long-term solution involves legislative and regulatory changes at the federal level to allow the legal banking of cannabis-related funds. California has expected a $1 billion in tax from the sale of recreational cannabis, but this is what actually happened. After initially anticipating $1 billion and receiving for annual tax revenue by legalizing the sale of recreational cannabis, what actually happened was that California will likely bring in just under $500 million in cannabis tax revenue for this fiscal year. That's lower than the $630 million forecasted in former Governor Jerry Brown's budget. Current governor, new budget projects the state will generate $355 million in cannabis excise taxes by the end of June. That's worse than underwhelming, considering that Washington State received $319 million in legal cannabis taxes and licensing fees during 2017. Colorado collected $247 million in 2017, and they have a population of just 7.5 million and 5.7 million respectively. California is the largest U.S. state with nearly 40 million people. If new states want to legalize retail cannabis sales and meet the respective tax revenue goals, they need to heed the lessons of California, and public equity investors in this space likewise should understand the issue as they assess the size of the addressable market. With that said, here's 3 major issues at play in California. 1, the taxes are too high, so it allows black market to still remain relevant. Number 2, California may have legalized the sale of recreational cannabis, but most cities still prohibit it. And 3, regulations are too onerous and complicated. To sum it up, we've covered the legal retail marijuana industry since its infancy 5 years ago, remain enthusiastic about its prospects. That said, California is likely an example of how the same regulations that made the recreational cannabis market possible can also hurt its growth. The right deregulation will ultimately drive growth rates for the industry, valuations for public pot companies over time. This is why it's taking so long for New Jersey, for example, to legalize retail cannabis sales through the state legislature. Lawmakers have the benefit of learning from states like California that missed the mark, even with the tailwind of an entrenched medical market with the existing infrastructure and distribution pipeline. Bottom line for investors in public pot stocks, pay attention to states and local tax rates and regulations as new markets open up, because this underappreciated factor will profoundly affect the industry's total addressable market. What's ahead for the cannabis industry in 2019? We start to look at 2019 and be much more promising for the cannabis industry than last year. The start of 2019 looks to be much more promising for the cannabis industry. If you recall, 2018 began with the Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinding the Cole memo for stocks, and subsequently having that entire industry plummet on the news. Many industries began to worry, and assets wouldn't be seized and restrictions would be made. And ripped from the headlines, why did Indiana court dismiss the Church of Cannabis's case to allow marijuana as a sacrament? The First Church of Cannabis has lost its final appeal in a legal battle aimed at forcing the state to permit the use of marijuana as a religious sacrament. The Indiana Court of Appeals dismissed the Church of Cannabis case December 28, after it failed to pay a court transcript fee and failed to present an argument as to why the appeal should not be dismissed. Laws against the possession, sale, and use of marijuana are designed to protect the health, safety, and well-being of Hoosiers statewide, the Attorney General said. Cannabis cafes and churches with cannabis will be a thing in due time. I believe the short term, though, is to have CBD drive that wedge for normalization, to provide for sampling of products at farms as well as cannabis cafes. And so with that normalization and allowing for a brick and mortar space to be the face in all of these cities and states and areas to have normalization occur, and sampling and product testing, that'll drive the market. And with that, that is it. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned next week for another edition of the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, Super Chronics, and I'm out.